I remember the first time I saw Willow. It was early spring in 2020, and the air still carried the scent of charred earth. Australia had just come through one of its most devastating wildfire seasons on record. The fires raged across the country, from Queensland to New South Wales, burning through eucalyptus forests and wildlife reserves that had stood for generations. I was a volunteer at the zoo then, working with the Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation team, and I had never seen anything like it. By the time the fires died down, they had scorched more than 46 million acres of land. Over 3 billion animals were affected. Entire populations of native species, koalas, kangaroos, sugar gliders, and wombats, were decimated. It wasn't just the numbers, though. It was the silence left behind in the forests. Trees stood blackened and leafless, the bushland eerily quiet. You don't forget that kind of stillness. Willow was found by a firefighter named Cam, on the edge of what used to be a koala corridor in the snowy Monaro region of New South Wales. He was doing a final check of an area they'd just contained when he spotted her. She was curled up at the base of a burned-out tree, her fur singed, her eyes glassy with pain and exhaustion. One of her ears was burned along the edge, and her paws, those strong, climbing hands, were raw and blistered from the smoldering bark she must have clung to. She didn't move when Cam approached. Koalas aren't aggressive, but they can be skittish around people. Not Willow. She didn't have the strength to resist. She just looked at him and blinked slowly, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm done." Cam radioed for a wildlife rescue unit and wrapped her in his jacket until help arrived. He gave her a name right then, Willow, after the trees that once lined the creek that ran near his childhood home. He said she reminded him of them, a little battered, but still standing. Willow was taken to a mobile triage center set up for fire-affected wildlife. These centers were temporary clinics, run out of converted vans or tents, operated by wildlife vets and volunteers like the ones I worked with. When I first met her, she was sedated on a padded table, her paws carefully wrapped in soft gauze, her fur trimmed around the worst burns. I remember her smell, a mix of eucalyptus oil and scorched fur, and her breath, shallow but steady. Her injuries were extensive but not beyond hope. She had third-degree burns on all 4 limbs, damage to her nose and ears, and her left eye had suffered heat exposure. But she was a fighter. She tolerated the bandage changes, the hydrotherapy soaks, the injections. The staff kept a close watch, monitoring her hydration and organ function. With koalas, stress alone can kill them, especially after trauma. But Willow had a calmness about her. She watched us with quiet eyes, alert but never panicked. One of the veterinarians, Dr. Lisa McAllister, said she'd never seen a koala with such resilience. "She's got a will to live," she told me during one of our overnight shifts. And that counts for a lot. Willow's care became part of our daily rhythm. Mornings started with vitals checks, medication, and her eucalyptus feed. We had to find fresh branches from areas untouched by the fires, which was becoming increasingly difficult. Koalas are notoriously picky eaters. Some only accept leaves from specific types of trees, but Willow was grateful for whatever we gave her. She ate slowly, deliberately, always finishing the leaves before the stems. In the afternoons, we did bandage changes and physical therapy. Her paws were the most delicate part. Koala pads are essential for climbing and gripping, and if too much scar tissue formed, she'd never return to the wild. We used a soft silicone-based dressing to reduce scarring and massaged her joints to keep them from stiffening. At night, we took turns staying with the critical patients. I often volunteered for Willow's room. It wasn't glamorous, just me in a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket with a thermos of tea, reading veterinary journals by the glow of a desk lamp. But those nights were important. Sometimes I'd hear her shift in her enclosure or reach up to grasp a branch for balance. I talked to her often, telling her stories from the zoo, about other animals that had made it through tough odds, an echidna with a broken beak, a wombat that was hit by a car and still learned to walk again. Something about Willow made me feel protective, in a way I hadn't experienced with other animals. Maybe it was her quiet courage, or the way she looked at you like she understood more than she let on. Maybe it was just because she had survived something so many others hadn't. When Willow was stable enough, the team made the decision to transfer her to the zoo for long-term recovery. It was a hard choice. Normally, the goal is always release, to return wildlife to their natural habitat as soon as they're able. But Willow's injuries meant she'd never fully regain her climbing ability, and with the loss of her territory to the fires, she wouldn't survive in the wild. We prepared a habitat for her in the Australian natives section of the zoo. It wasn't large, but it had everything she needed: climbing poles, fresh eucalyptus deliveries, shaded resting areas, and most importantly, safety. By the time she arrived, she was strong enough to walk on her own again, though her gait was slower, more cautious. The keepers gave her time to adjust, and we kept public access limited. She needed quiet, healing, and familiarity. I remember the day we opened her habitat to visitors. There was a woman with 2 young kids standing by the observation window. The little girl pressed her face to the glass, watching Willow munch on a branch, and asked, "Why does that koala have funny hands?" Her mother knelt beside her and said softly, "Because she was in a fire." But she made it. That was when I realized something. Willow wasn't just a survivor. She was a symbol. People came to see her not out of pity, but because she represented something larger: endurance, hope, the ability to heal even when everything around you has burned. That first part of Willow's journey, from the blackened forest floor to the quiet sanctuary of the zoo, was just the beginning. Her story wasn't over, and neither was ours. The wildfires had taken so much, but they hadn't taken her. And as long as Willow lived, there was a piece of that bushland spirit still alive, still quietly chewing eucalyptus in the sun. By the time Willow had settled into her new home at the zoo, the fires had become something people spoke of in past tense, but for those of us working in wildlife care, the aftermath was very much present. We saw it in every bandaged paw, every orphaned joey, every scorched tree stump that once shaded thriving ecosystems. But Willow, in her quiet corner of the Australian natives exhibit, was a constant, living reminder of what had survived. Willow's enclosure was modest by design, tailored not just for physical needs but for emotional recovery. We placed a few low platforms that allowed her to climb without stress. Specially treated logs were wrapped in soft rope so her healing paws wouldn't be irritated. The habitat was lined with native plants, not just eucalyptus but bottlebush and wattle, creating a naturalistic buffer from the outside world. It was during this phase, after the immediate crisis had passed and the long road to adaptation had begun, that I really got to know her. Koalas are creatures of habit. They rest up to 20 hours a day and are slow, deliberate movers. But Willow was different. She was alert, responsive. She'd watch us with interest as we cleaned or prepared feed, occasionally shifting position to get a better view. Once, while I refilled her water bowl, one felt the lightest brush against my shoulder. She had reached down with one paw from her perch to touch my sleeve, then pulled back and resumed her watch. Just a moment, but I'll never forget it. I began spending my off hours with her, just sitting nearby and talking softly. It's something we do with animals recovering from trauma, offering presence without demand. I told her about the other animals, the new rescue wallabies that were arriving from a sanctuary up north, about the elderly echidna in our care who had a taste for pumpkin. I told her about the visitors who asked about her, who left letters and drawings. One little boy named Ethan sent in a crayon picture of a koala with superhero gloves. On the back, he'd written, "For Willow, so her hands don't hurt anymore." Her fame was growing in quiet ripples. Not through social media campaigns or zoo billboards, but through word of mouth. People would ask for her by name. She became a symbol not of what was lost, but of what we could still protect. Teachers brought classes to see her and learn about the impact of wildfires and climate change. A university student working on a wildlife rehabilitation thesis spent hours quietly sketching her. Her presence was a conversation starter, a gentle but powerful one. But healing, real healing, is never linear. One morning, we noticed Willow hadn't moved from her night perch. Not unusual on its own, koalas are sedentary, but something in her posture looked off. We found that one of the old burn scars on her rear limb had reopened. Scar tissue, unlike healthy skin, doesn't stretch or grow well. It can break with time or strain, and that's exactly what had happened. We rushed her into the treatment room. Watching her go through procedures again, being sedated, cleaned, and rebandaged, was gutting. She'd come so far. The vet team worked quickly and calmly, and once she was stable, we moved her to the quarantine ward to minimize infection risk. For the next 2 weeks, it was back to 24-hour monitoring. I took every shift I could. It was during those nights in quarantine that I learned the most about resilience, not just hers, but ours too. The keepers, the vets, the volunteers, we had all been changed by the fires. Some had lost homes, others had lost animals they'd raised from infancy. Yet everyone kept showing up. We clung to small wins, a good weight gain, a steady heartbeat, the first time Willow reached for a branch again. She pulled through, of course. That's what Willow did. She didn't bounce back the way she had before, but that was okay. She learned to rest more, to distribute her weight differently when climbing. We made adjustments to her habitat again, lower branches, extra padding on her preferred resting spots, regular check-ins with the vet. Not long after, a decision was made to officially retire Willow from public viewing on most days. She'd still be visible occasionally, but our focus shifted from showcasing her to protecting her. She had done enough. She had survived the fire, healed through unimaginable pain, and helped thousands understand the cost of climate disasters. People sometimes asked why we kept animals like Willow instead of releasing them. It's a fair question. The answer is never simple. Koalas like her, with burn damage and altered mobility, face overwhelming odds in the wild. Even with intact habitat, she would struggle to escape predators, compete for food, or even climb efficiently. But beyond that, Willow had found something else in captivity: safety, stability, and purpose. She wasn't just alive, she mattered. During the anniversary of the fires, a ceremony was held in the zoo's amphitheater. Families came to plant eucalyptus saplings in biodegradable pots that would later be transferred to reforestation zones. The event wasn't solemn, it was hopeful. Willow was part of the opening remarks, though she wasn't brought out. Instead, we shared photos of her journey. The burned paws, the bandaged limbs, her first bite of eucalyptus in her zoo habitat. The room was quiet, not from sadness, but reverence. As the crowd dispersed, I noticed a girl, maybe 10 or 11, holding her small pot with both hands. She approached me and asked, was she really on fire? I nodded. Not flames directly, but close enough. The ground was so hot it burned her paws. The smoke could have suffocated her. She looked down at the little sapling in her hands. She lived, though. She did, I said. She still does. The girl smiled and said, then maybe this tree will live too. That's the thing about stories like Willow's. They aren't loud. They don't end in dramatic rescues or sweeping musical scores. They unfold slowly, with small, quiet victories, each one earned with patience and care. By the end of her second year at the zoo, Willow had become a part of the rhythm of the place. New keepers learned her story during training. Visitors who had come as children returned as teens, remembering the koala who survived the fires. Her fur never fully grew back in places, and her ears bore the scars of that terrible season, but she didn't need to be whole to be worthy of love, attention, and protection. She reminded us every day that survival wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Willow never asked for attention. That was something I always admired about her. In a world that often measures value by noise and speed, she simply existed, with quiet persistence, in a way that changed the people around her. By her third year with us at the zoo, she had become not just a koala recovering from trauma, but a constant presence. A survivor whose story rippled far beyond the glass of her enclosure. Not long after she was taken off daily public view, her habitat was redesigned to make it more private and enriching. It included taller perches, better climate control for hot days, and softer bedding. We rotated in new branches from a carefully maintained grove of eucalyptus trees, all grown pesticide-free and tended specifically for our koalas. Willow preferred the blue gums, always had, and we made sure they were stocked in her area each morning. There's something about routine that comforts animals in recovery. It comforts humans, too. Mornings with Willow had their rhythm. We'd check her temperature and hydration levels, replace her browse, the eucalyptus branches, observe her movement and stool. Yes, even that became something I tracked with surprising dedication. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was sacred. Because each of those small markers, how much she ate, how much she moved, were signs she was okay. Occasionally, she'd have flare-ups from her old injuries. That's something people don't always understand about burn survivors. Healing isn't a one-time thing. Even years later, scar tissue can react to stress, temperature changes, and aging. In Willow's case, her paws remained the most sensitive. The nerve damage made it important to monitor her climbing, and we adapted her environment continually. The zoo community, staff and volunteers alike, grew incredibly protective of her. We kept her schedule flexible. She had heat lamps installed for cold days, shaded retreats for hot ones, and a camera system that allowed the vet team to monitor her remotely if needed. We made it a point never to stress her, never to rush her. She'd been through enough. Outside the gates of the zoo, Willow's story continued to work its way into the wider world. Conservation groups used her case as part of wildfire education programs. Her image appeared in slide decks, in public school lesson plans, and even once on the back of a city bus. Her eyes framed by those unmistakable notches where her ears had burned, the caption reading, "Still here. Still healing." For me, one of the most moving moments came during a school outreach day. We'd set up a booth outside the Australian Natives Zone, and kids from a rural primary school had come to learn about native animals and climate change. One boy, maybe 12, held a notebook filled with drawings of wildlife. He approached our display, saw the laminated timeline of Willow's recovery, and said softly, "I think we had one like her in our paddock." Before the fire. His voice cracked just a little on that last word. His teacher gave me a look that said he hadn't talked much about it until now. I crouched next to him and asked, "Did you see it during the fire?" "No," he said, "after. But it was already gone." Then he added, "I like that she made it. That's what Willow did for people. She gave them a place to put their grief. Not to ignore it, but to walk through it." With her story, it wasn't about pretending everything turned out fine. It didn't. The fires were a national trauma. People died. Millions of animals perished. Vast ecosystems may never recover. But Willow made it. And because she made it, people could talk about what they'd lost, and what was still worth protecting. One winter morning, I came in early, just as the fog was beginning to lift. Willow was in her high perch, half asleep, her nose nestled into a fresh branch. She always looked so small up there. Fragile, almost. But that was just the surface. Beneath it was steel. Not flashy, not loud, just unbending. She had every reason to give up, and she didn't. Later that same day, our team got word that several koalas rescued from another recent fire had been successfully released back into the wild. It was rare good news in a field full of hard days. We celebrated in our quiet way, an extra long lunch, an extra round of enrichment for the animals. When I visited Willow that afternoon, I brought her an especially full load of blue gum. She accepted it slowly, lifting her arm with that familiar, cautious grace. Her paws still bore the pink and white ridges of healed skin, but they worked. Not like before, but well enough. More than enough. She blinked at me in that slow way she had, eyes half-lidded in that koala dreaming sort of way, and resumed chewing. Willow lived another full year beyond that, quietly, comfortably, surrounded by people who loved her. When she passed, peacefully, in her sleep, it was early autumn. The zoo closed her exhibit for the day. Flowers appeared at the gate, notes from children and adults alike. One read simply, "Thank you for staying." We held a private ceremony, just for staff and volunteers. No speeches, just shared silence and the rustle of gum leaves in the wind. Today, in the zoo's conservation garden, there's a tree planted in her name, a Eucalyptus robusta, tall and strong. At its base is a plaque that reads, "Willow. She survived the fire, and helped us remember what mattered." Visitors still ask about her. Some remember her by name. Others just remember the koala who came through the flames and kept going. And I remember her every day. Not because she was the most famous animal I ever worked with, but because she showed me that recovery is possible, even after the worst happens. She taught me patience, stillness, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't roar, it simply endures. Willow didn't change the world, but she changed a little part of mine. And that, I think, is how real stories work. Not all at once, but one life, one choice, one moment at a time.